The one person I am pleased to see this evening here is James. And I'm going to hand over to James now to tell us about the Trenance murder. Over to you, James.
Thank you. Right. Probably better clap at the end. Okay. I'm going to try and use the microphone. Hopefully that will be better for people. Make sure everyone can hear at the back.
Well done.
Good. One request, if we could have questions at the end, and it'd be nice to, have a bit of a discussion about the things, because I'm sure the things that people want to talk about will go a bit wider than the actual content of this, because we're going to have to cut it down to keep it sort of on track to the Josie family. Okay. Other comment is, if you can't read the slides, because it is going to be a bit sort of death by PowerPoint, if you can't read the slides, don't worry too much, because everything's up there I'm going to be saying, so you won't miss anything as long as you can hear me. Okay. Well, why am I here? That's a good question. It goes back to a talk probably nearly a year ago now, when David came and did a talk on the Mullion murder. And I came along here fully expecting to hear him talk about the murder at Trenance. But it wasn't to be. This was the other murder, the highway murder. So that was very informative. And we just got talking, and somehow I ended up here now to tell you about the tragedy at Trenance. Where it comes from is Peter West. So I don't take any credit for this at all. Peter West, who a lot of you will have known, but obviously he's been passed now probably over 20 years. But back in 1989, I was the editor of the Mullion Messenger, which we did about 6 issues of it. But what we did manage to do was to get people to write some articles on local things. And Peter went away and did a lot of research on the Trenance murders and the Josie family and their involvement with Trenance. So that's what we're going to talk about. So it's Josie's family who lived at Trenance back in the turn of the 19th century. They lived there for about 100 years. And a look a bit about the family and particularly what they did to Methodism in Mullion, or did for Methodism in Mullion. Okay, so that's I've got a bit of feedback there, sorry. Right, there's the first slide. That's a picture, it's bleached out a little bit, but it is the picture of Trenance. Now, just so everybody knows what we're talking about, this is the old Trenance farmhouse, next to what's the chocolate factory nowadays, which was Trenance Barton. But back in these days, what we're talking about is Trenance farmhouse. It's the only Mullion entry in the Domesday Book. So it's the sort of, if you like, the oldest piece of documented history in Mullion. And that was 1086. It was called Trenant in those days. It's become Trenance. And in part of that, there were recorded 60 acres of pasture, which doesn't actually sound an awful lot, because it was, to be the only farm mentioned, it was obviously one of the larger settlements there. And it was owned or held by a man called Bletchew, and it was owned by the Count of Mortain. Now, Count of Mortain, I think he styled himself as the Earl of Cornwall at one time, but this is, going back to William the Conqueror's days, and he was given by William the Conqueror Cornwall, Devon, and Somerset, or a lot of Somerset, and a bit Dorset as well. So he's very much an absentee landlord, and he probably never came to Mullion anyway. But he was the owner of the Count of Mortain. But hold on to that name, because we'll come back to that. later on. As I said, the Josie family lived in Trenance for about 100 years, up until 1897. So they would have been there at the end of the 18th century, into the 19th century. Okay, technology has failed me already. Maybe we'll get rid of that. We're back on track. Okay. Yeah. Hopefully you can see from over this side, but I've got to stand somewhere. I'll move around a bit. Okay. So this is the story of the Josie family, who lived at Trenance 400 years, as we said. Now, this gets a bit complicated because, as was the habit of a lot of these old families, they all used the same Christian names over and over again. So we'll be talking about 3 Jeremiahs, a couple of Williams, and they're also integral to the story. But when we go on to the next slide, I've got a bit of a family tree, so hopefully that will make a bit of sense. And one of the things, when Peter wrote this article, he wrote it very concisely, but it can be a bit confusing because of the actual names. Now, there were 3 Josie brothers who came to Trenance and took, now obviously Fletcher and all those others, hundreds of years have passed, nearly 500 years have passed up until then. So numbers of people had owned or leased Trenance. And 3 Josie brothers, they were of quite a large family. Their father had 10 children, and 7 of those were boys. But 3 of the boys, one William, Jeremiah and Thomas, acquired the lease of Trenance to farm it. Other parts, apparently there was another Joseph Thomas of Trevitho, William Foxwell, and this was quite a large farm for that time. But they were, you know, sort of quite a large concern. They, hold on, let's go to the next bit. They were early converts to Methodism, and William and Thomas, 2 of the brothers, were trustees of the first Mullion Chapel, and that's the chapel that was in Chapel Place, the very small chapel. So, you know, they were part of there. There were other trustees, some traditional Mullion names, Hendy, Mundy, Thomas, Shepherd and Willie. So those are names obviously which, you know, still very much live on in the village today. Now, Jeremiah Jones, he's the one we're interested in. He's was known as a hot-tempered man. This comes from the memoirs of Elizabeth Thomas, who she was herself a Jose. And obviously Peter has discovered these memoirs. I'm not too sure where they exist, but he did a lot of research at the County Museum. Find out which way I'm pointing this, because obviously picking up off the speaker there. Okay. Right. So within Trenance in those days, so in 1827, there were about 20 people living in the farmhouse there. So there was 2 families. For one unknown reason, it was William and Jeremiah who actually lived in the farmhouse. Thomas, I don't quite know where he lived, so obviously Peter didn't discover that. But so it was only 2 out of the 3 brothers actually lived in the farmhouse. The actual house that they lived in isn't the present one. It isn't the one that was shown in the picture. It isn't the one that the Tyler Streets live in now. It was behind there. the original farmhouse, and obviously that was demolished sometime, I think it was 1865 or something like that. That was demolished, and a new farmhouse was built in the front. And so it's up sort of somewhere up where the swimming pool is now, I would guess. Now there's West Britain report, because there's again a lot of the only records we've got are actually the newspaper reports. So the West Britain report of the 4th of April 1828 describes this as the residence of a family. And the family comprised, obviously, William and Jeremiah, their wives and children and household servants. And the 1841 return records 7 servants at Trenance, 5 men and boys and 2 women. And named are, amongst those, again, Mullion names, 2 Willies, 2 Thomases, a Gilbert and a Tresize. So all in all, there would have been 20-odd people resident in the house at that time, given that that's smaller than the houses at the moment. Okay, now, to try and make some sense of this, we're back to the numbers of names. Francis Jones here, he's the father. So he was the one with the 10 children. Okay, and of those, 3 of the boys was Thomas, who was born in 1768, Jeremiah, who was born in 1771, and William. Now those, can we turn this down a little bit? Getting feedback off that speaker, I think it's not so bad as that. Okay, if I do it from this side. Sorry. Okay. So these are the 3 brothers we're talking about. I should make some faces and fly birds across. Okay, how's that? We'll try it. Yeah, okay. So these are the 3 brothers here who have got the lease for Trenance Farm: William, Jeremiah, and Thomas. Now, of William, he has a son called William, another son called Francis. There's Anne and Mary Jose and another 2 daughters. So that was William's side of his family. Jeremiah here, he has a son called Jeremiah. And there's another Elizabeth Jose, who married John Thomas, so it's Elizabeth Thomas. So that's the lady who wrote the memoirs. And another 5 daughters. So Jeremiah only had the 1 son. This Jeremiah only had the 1 son. And again, going further on, Jeremiah had another son called Jeremiah. So later on, we'll be referring to these as Jeremiah 1, Jeremiah 2, and Jeremiah 3. Okay. And along the top here, William Jose had another son called William, but he was William Francis and became known as Frank. So that's the bit of the Jose family we're interested in. Now, the 2 people we're very interested in are Jeremiah here and Francis, because those are the 2 involved in the murder. Right. Wednesday, December the 5th, 1827. Sorted out. Jeremiah Jose had issued a distress warrant against his nephew Francis. Now, a distress warrant is where somebody owes something, there is a debt to be paid, and the warrant is given allowing goods to be taken in exchange for that debt, to settle the debt. This is Peter's words, but he could find no evidence that Jeremiah was greedy, avaricious, or a hard man of business. I mean, he was another family member. and obviously, Francis was his nephew. So we don't really know why this warrant was issued. But seized under the warrant were cattle. Now, we don't know how many that included. It might have been 1 or 2 cows, could have been bullocks. It could have, the history doesn't record that. But whatever it does record is that it was obviously taken through law. It was issued, that would have been granted by a magistrate. And a constable had seized the cattle from Francis and had brought them to Trenance to give them to Jeremiah in settle of this debt. Like I said, we don't know what the debt was. But in those days, farms, the livestock was probably much more important than the dead stock, because in terms of the machinery and the equipment that the farm had, it would have been a few ploughs, it might have been a weighing, scythes, things like that. Fairly small items. The main value in the farm would have been in the stock, in the cattle, or sheep or whatever would be traded to raise the revenue of the farm. So the fact that this warrant had been issued taking away Francis's cattle, some cattle from him, was a very serious thing, and could likely have bankrupted Francis. We don't know where he farmed. We don't know whether he farmed on the farm or adjacent farm, but whatever. Cattle had been taken from him. Go back just to reinforce that Elizabeth Thomas does refer to Jeremiah's hot temper. It was obviously a fairly drastic measure for him to take. And of course, in the farmhouse, a dispute arose. Again, it was, the cattle had arrived. Presumably Francis had come along as well. And obviously there's, an argument. Now, Francis declared it, and this is according to the paper accounts, and quote, an unfriendly act, and called Jeremiah a knave and an old dog. Now, that sounds probably pretty mild by modern standards, but given the time, given the fact that this was, known to be a very religious family, words like that would have been something very, very serious. And said, to somebody who was known to be fairly hot-tempered. And there's the next bit. Yeah. Francis came up close to his uncle, who apparently had his hands in his pockets. It's amazing, we've got sort of these small details like this and the big details missing. But he came up, he had his hands in his pocket. Jeremiah lost all self-control. He withdrew his hands from his pocket, and in his hand he had a nail. Well, a nail is one thing. Some other reports say it was a gimlet, but it was certainly a sharp iron object. And with that, he lunged at Francis and struck him on the temple with this nail. And of course, that penetrated his skull, and the murder was committed. The words of the inscription, which you'll see at the moment, is that he staggered, fell, and died. And again, we get all the gory details come through history. He died within 3 minutes. Okay. Francis was 26 years old, and Jeremiah was 55. So it's a young man really struck down in his prime. If you go into Mullion Cemetery, that is the gravestone of Francis, and the inscription, which is, you can hardly see it, it's almost down in the weeds in the bottom here, but it says, "His life was taken from the earth, not by burning nor pining sickness. A hand which should have fostered did the fatal deed, and by a nail transfixed he staggered, fell and died." That's a pretty good inscription for a headstone, isn't it? Now, we have, again from the record, an indication that Jeremiah was struck down with remorse from what had happened there. And he said, and he is quoted as saying, "If I have done it, I would give a room full of gold to store him again." Of course, Jeremiah was detained upon a coroner's warrant and was committed to stand trial at Bodmin Assizes. Now, the report here comes from the Royal Cornwall Gazette of the 5th of April, 1828, so that would have been after the trial had taken place. And the trial took place in Bodmin in 1828. Now, here we go back into the mysteries of time, because there's no court transcripts, or certainly Peter couldn't find any court transcripts of the trial, which adds to the mystery of the whole thing. We don't know whether Jeremiah did plead guilty. We assume he did, because it was a bit open and shut, really. There's no record of who the judge was or the counsel. So there's only the few statements of the actual newspaper accounts of the time. Now, it's we do know that William, Francis's brother, gave evidence. This is not Francis's dad, William. This is his brother, William. Gave evidence, and one or two close relatives of both parties. We don't know what evidence they gave, but throughout the trial, Jeremiah was reported to have sighed deeply, and probably thinking of the gallows, because the punishment for murder then could easily have been hanging. It was pretty open and shut case. It was, I'm sure, very difficult for him to plead anything other than guilty. The verdict: he was found guilty of the willful murder of his nephew. So that's actually guilty of murder. It's not manslaughter; it's murder that they've given him a sentence for. And the sentence, that seems a bit lenient as well for the times. It was transportation for life. So, that could have been one of the colonies, possibly Australia, or whatever. Now, we can only imagine that even that, as a sentence, is pretty damning for a man. He's 55 years old, he's got a family in Mullion, and he's going to be committed to the other side of the world for the rest of his life. Not to see his family again. Peter sort of puts it down, describes it as a living death. They did survive, but I mean, certainly not something for him to, certainly want to look forward to. However, there's a twist in the tale here, because the judge reopened the court and commuted the sentence to 2 years imprisonment. So again, you imagine the time. Getting 2 years imprisonment for murder is certainly unusual. And of course the records don't explain why. They don't explain why the judge reopened the court, why this happened. And here we step in to Peter's opinion. Okay. Now, Peter thinks that an explanation could simply be bribery. Okay. There's no known there's new evidence or anything else, but Peter's thoughts are that a payment, a word to a corrupt clerk. Peter puts the talk of 100 golden guineas, which would be a lot of money in those days, that perhaps arrange something that to get the lighter sentence. Now, again, Peter's statements there is that both William and Jeremiah were partners at Trenance, so one would assume that of the three brothers, they shared the profits of the farm. They died within 5 years of each other. Now, William's will was proved at £190,000. Now, this Peter has put here in present day values. Now, this is 1990. Okay. Still doesn't seem to be an enormous amount of money, even in 1990. And Jeremiah's was £95,000. So that's sort of, £100,000 different. Whichever way you look at it, whatever way you take the value of the money, it's about half. And Peter's argument is there. That the possibility is that the reason why, given the fact that Jeremiah did spend 2 years away when he was in jail, but the reason could be why that was the money that was given to the judge to buy the bride. Okay. So, and obviously there's no facts to support that, but we take Peter's idea on that. And we wonder now whether Peter had a little bit of more knowledge about this, a bit more insight into the family that he actually says here, and that might become sort of obvious a bit later on. Now, Jeremiah went away and he served his 2 years in prison, and he came back to Mullion. And that in itself is quite unusual because, again, in those days, for a community to accept a murderer back into the community. He didn't live at Trenance again. He went to live at a house then called Crofts, and it was located between Park Venton-Sar and Trenance, somewhere down Garrow Lane. And Peter says it was on the site of the present Malcolm House. It was known, the Crofts was known to have been destroyed by fire. So he didn't come back to Trenance. Maybe that was seen as unacceptable. And like I say, he came back to Crofts, which was still part of the farm, and he was still farming on the farm. Obviously, it's not known how he was accepted in the village, but there was a sort of, modus vivendi, way of living around it, the way of living together was obviously sorted out. But, like I say, he went back to his family, and they obviously accepted him back, so he's a business partner. So he wasn't sort of cast out of the family. He came back and he carried on his business. And there's an example there that his brother was Francis's brother, so this is the brother of the man he's killed, was prepared to sign a signature to Jeremiah's will. So the family was still obviously together as a cohesive unit, which is quite a tribute to their forgiveness. However, Jeremiah eventually died of epilepsy in 1845, and he is buried in Mullion churchyard. He was 74 years old, but he isn't buried in the family plot. He's got a little plot of his own near the Kempthorne family graves. I must admit, I've had a look around the churchyard. I haven't been able to find that grave, but there are probably some charts of it. Right, we'll now go on, and Peter moves on to talk a little bit about how they carried on, the family went on after that. And there's another one of these little family trees here. So we have here, there's William II. There's William II up here. So that's brother of Francis, the man who's murdered. Jeremiah II, that is the son of Jeremiah. They continued to farm at Trenance together. Okay, and then from that, his son, we've got Elizabeth Thomas, who's wrote the diary. We've got William Francis Frank, and he married Ada Thomas. Peter makes a note there that that's of the Randall Thomas and Thomas family, or the solicitors. And they go on here. Now this is the laying of the foundation stone of the present chapel. Okay, and it was laid in 1877 by John Thomas, again husband of Elizabeth, and the address was later given by Frank up here at Tremony Barn. So it's going into, yeah. Yeah, so sort of quotes from here, from Peter's words. Mr. Ivor Thomas, in his book Methodism in Mullion, states that William Jose, or that's William II Jose, first one on the left there, has a love of music and one of the founders of the Sunday school. He married fairly late, a Jacks from Sydney, and he had 2 daughters and a son. Yeah, Jeremiah II was over 50 when he married, and his bride Agnes Thomas from Treviso was much younger. They had 5 children, and the youngest being born when Jeremiah was 63. And the comment here from Peter is obviously a young wife is a great help in these matters. So, yeah, William II died in 1869, and then was followed by his only son. This is Francis Frank. Okay, and he was married to Ada Thomas of Randall Thomas and Thomas. So Frank Jose, as we said, was a prominent Methodist, and was one of the closely related group of trustees who got together to construct the present Methodist chapel. As they'd outgrown the Chapel Place chapel, which obviously is very small. I'm not too sure how many people could get in there, but it would certainly be crowded with half a dozen, I should imagine. It was very small. And then, foundation though stone was laid by John Thomas, Elizabeth's husband and cousin, on Feast Sunday of 1877. And afterwards they went to Tremony Barn, where Frank Jose gave the address. So the family, very, very much part, or the family as they went on, very much part of, Mullion Methodist. Down here you'll see that Jeremiah III, he had 2 sons and 4 daughters. He left Trenance. He was the last of the Joses to live in Trenance and to farm Trenance. And he left in 1897, moved up to Sussex, took his young family, and Peter says here, then after that, Trenance went to the Priors, the Harveys, followed by the Pengellies and the Newtons. And of course, now we have the Tyler Streets are in there at the moment. in that same house. Obviously, there's been a lot of changes. What Peter recalls. So yeah, that's what we've been through that. Jeremiah never went back there. Jeremiah 2 was the final. He actually ended the family's association with it. Okay. And Millie Jose was Frank's daughter, and she was actually known to Peter West, so he obviously knew her when he was a younger man. And she lived in Rose Cottage, which is now Mullion House, until her death in 1945. So, as Peter puts it, she was the last of that Josie line of families who actually lived in Mullion. And in Peter's words here, the Joses of Trenance had now run their course, and with the departure of Jeremiah 2 in 1897, their long association with Trenance ended. It was at Trenance that they had lived and loved, and from Trenance that they had made their contribution, first to nonconformity and then to Methodism in Mullion. And above all, it was at Trenance that they had undergone and survived their own family tragedy, when their own had shed the blood of their own, and in departing, perhaps they left their footprints in the sands of time. Now, Peter makes a bit of disclosure of personal interest here. He's got something to own up to, and this is why I say he may have knowledge that he hasn't actually put down here, and certainly when he's talking about the bribery. Peter says that Jeremiah Jose, who was convicted of the murder of his nephew in 1827, was Peter's great-great-grandfather. Why he was, he says, writers of articles should always disclose any interest they have in the subject matter. And now has the time come to disclose my interest in the Jose family. And even after the passage of 160 years, remembering it's nearly 200 years now, I do so with some hesitation. You see, Jeremiah Jose was convicted of the murder of his nephew and was his great-great-grandfather. He put some thanks after that to Ben Newton, who had a copy of the Domesday Book entry for Trenance, and to the Records and Archives of the Cornwall Local Studies Library in Redruth, and the County Truro. And then I know personally that Peter put in an enormous amount of work into this. And finally, in doing this research, it's just amazing how small the world is, because you think, well, I wasn't born in Mullion, so what possible link could I have to Trenance Farm? Apart from that, we've got a horse buried there, but that's another thing. But going back way years ago, my cousin did my family history on my mother's side. And after a lot of research, she eventually came back jubilant one day. She said, I traced our family all the way back to William the Conqueror. Not only is it traced back to it, but it's actually on the legitimate side. Yeah, most of the rest of the country is on, anyway. Of course, if we go back to the Count of Mortain, he was William the Conqueror's half-brother, on his mother's side. So all of a sudden I'm finding out that I've got a personal link, a very remote one, to Trenance. So it's amazing what, like I say, it's a small world, and it's amazing what we can find out. Now, I don't know if anybody's got any questions or anything they want to add to that, because obviously there's quite a lot of history that's missing from that. But there was one little thing I came up with while I was doing this, which, if I can find my piece of paper here, I found a report. It's in the National Archives, and it's got the name Francis Jones associated with it, and the date of 1818. And I'm thinking, oh, this is good. It sounds like it's the same Francis. Looked at it a bit closer, and the ages are a couple of years out. So had a bit more of a digging. But here it said there's a report of John Vivian on a John Harris, who was convicted at the last Cornwall Easter Assizes held in Truro in 1818 of robbing Mullion Mill of flour belonging to William Rees and John Tippett. That took place during March. Then there are sworn statements by Francis Jose, who was 14 years old, and James Jose, who was 18 years old, of Mullion, Cornwall. Now there was grounds for clemency because Francis Jose and James Jose had admitted robbing the mill. Now this is Criggan Mill that it happened, and it absolved the prisoner of any involvement in the crime. And the conviction of the prisoner had rested on the evidence of footprints. So that's real Agatha Christie stuff, isn't it? Footprints in the flour leaving the mill. And those were identified as those of Francis Jones. So the initial sentence was not given, and the recommendation mercy to be pardoned and pardon prepared. Now it's quite interesting there because you immediately think, because my first thought was, this is Francis Jones. He was a bit of a wrong un. He was in trouble. But it wasn't, because as we said, Francis Jones, it's a huge family, and everyone was called Francis or William or Jeremiah. So it turns out that this Francis is actually the son of John Jose, another of the Jose brothers. And there was James Jose and Francis Jose were two brothers there, so it wasn't ours. But you do get the thinking, and you do get the thinking about the people and putting it into context. And you've got a family here who we know are very religious, so they're following the faith. Two boys, teenage boys, stealing flour. Now, they'd be stealing beer or cakes or something like that. You'd have thought, no, that's sort of, but they're stealing flour. So you think, well, are they stealing it for the family because they're actually hungry? Maybe they took it home and the mother said, nobody steals flour here, sort of thing. Go and own up to it. And see that would save this poor fellow Harris, but he would have been sentenced and probably imprisoned for the theft. It's not clear from this description what happened to the Joseph boys. One assumes that the pardon was for them as well as for Harris. But I thought it's just a lovely insight into the way the family was working, the way Mullion was working in those days. So there was, some good people there, and some bad ones as well, I guess. Okay, thank you very much for that. I'll leave that there, and